blind bride was humiliated at her wedding in front of everyone, the laughter echoing like knives. But what no one realized was that Big Shaq was watching from the shadows, quietly catching every twist of cruelty. As Logan Mercer's betrayal unfolded before the world, Big Shaq's silent watch turned into a storm of truth, ready to turn the tables in a way no one expected. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The day dawned sharp and clear, with sunlight slicing through the ancient oaks lining the Mercer family estate. The manicured lawns shimmered with dew, as waiters in crisp black uniforms arranged flutes of champagne on silver trays, preparing for a celebration that would be as glossy as it was disingenuous. Guests began arriving in sleek imported cars, stepping out in silk dresses and tailored suits, their laughter a little too high, their smiles a shade too wide. They paused before the grand stone facade, cameras flashing, drinks exchanged, while the house itself, a sprawling mansion of cold marble and polished brass, loomed silent behind them. Kira Johnson, the bride-to-be, stood near the edge of the terrace, her white cane resting lightly against her fingers. The cane, though necessary, felt like a prop today, a symbol of frailty that the Mercer family could parade for their guests. Her dress, a shimmering cascade of ivory satin, draped gracefully over her slender form. Her hair styled into a smooth chignon, revealed a delicate neck marked by faint scars she no longer tried to hide. To those watching from afar, she was the picture of poise and resilience, a woman made more beautiful by her tragedy. But to Logan Mercer, her fiancé, she was an accessory to his carefully curated image, a testament to his benevolence and charm. Logan emerged from a knot of laughing friends, his arm wrapped casually around the shoulders of an older man whose handshake had lingered a bit too long with the event planner. Logan's smile was wide but brittle, his teeth flashing in the sun as he maneuvered the social terrain like a practiced politician. His family, seated beneath the white tent overlooking the rose garden, offered subtle nods of approval as they observed him. His mother, Evelyn Mercer, her pearls glinting at her throat, offered Kira a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The rest of the family followed suit, their greetings smooth but perfunctory, each touch of Kira's arm accompanied by murmured reassurances and sympathetic glances. As the guests settled into their chairs, the air thickened with the scent of roses and the low hum of conversation. A quartet of musicians tuned their instruments near the garden fountain, the notes sharp and jarring against the carefully arranged serenity. Kira stood at the threshold between the terrace and the garden, feeling the tension settle around her like a second skin. She could hear the faint, practiced laughter of Logan's friends, the clink of glasses, the rustle of expensive fabric. Their words, low and edged with mockery, reached her ears in fragments, though they thought her too blind to notice. She turned slightly, her face serene but her mind racing. Today was supposed to be the culmination of promises made in hospital rooms and whispered vows at moonlit dinners, but already the cracks were showing. Logan's attentiveness was laced with impatience. His whispered endearments rang hollow. The weight of the gown on her shoulders felt heavier than its fabric alone could justify. At the far end of the garden, unnoticed by most of the guests, a tall figure stepped through the side entrance. His presence was casual, yet undeniable. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal, NBA legend, entrepreneur, and longtime family friend of Kira's late father, moved with the quiet grace of a man who had nothing to prove. His tailored suit, dark against the white flowers and pale stone, gave him a solemnity that contrasted with the forced cheer around him. Few recognized him at first, but those who did exchanged surprised glances. Shaq's gaze swept the scene, noting the subtle discomfort in Kira's posture, the too careful way Logan guided her toward the center of the gathering. He watched the older guests whisper behind their gloved hands, the way the server seemed to navigate around Kira as though afraid to disrupt her. His expression remained neutral, but his dark eyes tracked every movement with quiet intensity. As the musicians began to play a lilting prelude, Logan's voice rose above the murmurs. "Kira, darling, come meet the councilman and his wife," he called, his tone dripping with practiced charm. She allowed him to guide her across the grass, her steps measured and elegant. The councilman, a broad-shouldered man with a firm handshake and a smile that felt like a mask, murmured something about bravery and sacrifice. His wife, thin-lipped and bejeweled, echoed the sentiment with a brittle laugh. "Such an inspiration," she said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Logan is so lucky to have someone as devoted as you, Kira." Kira smiled faintly, her fingers tightening slightly on the handle of her cane. "It's always a privilege to be surrounded by people who recognize resilience," she replied softly, her tone so smooth it was almost gentle. Logan's hand hovered near her back, a touch that felt more like control than comfort. "Let's move on," he said quickly, guiding her toward a group of younger guests whose laughter sharpened as they approached. Kira could hear them whispering behind their champagne glasses, their words just out of reach. Big Shaq remained near the edge of the gathering, blending into the background but observing everything. His stance was relaxed, one hand resting lightly in his pocket, but his eyes were alert. He caught the glances between Logan and his friends, the way they seemed to coordinate subtle jokes at Kira's expense. Shaq's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing, choosing instead to wait, to watch. The air grew heavier as the afternoon deepened, the sun casting long shadows across the garden. Kira felt the weight of every smile, every comment, every forced laugh. It was a performance, a carefully choreographed dance in which she was both the star and the victim. The subtle cruelty of Logan's family and friends coiled around her like a snake, its fangs hidden but its presence undeniable. Yet even as the shadows lengthened, there was a quiet strength in Kira's bearing. She moved with a grace that belied the strain beneath the surface, her voice soft but steady, her gestures precise. Logan's condescension became more pronounced as the day wore on, his touch tightening on her arm, his whispers edged with frustration when she didn't respond exactly as he expected. Big Shaq's presence, though silent, grew more significant. He exchanged a brief glance with one of the servers, a young man whose expression flickered with discomfort. Shaq's nod was almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. The young man moved away, disappearing into the house. As the musicians shifted into a livelier tune, Logan called for a toast, his voice echoing across the garden. "To my beautiful bride," he declared, lifting his glass high. "To Kira, whose courage and grace inspire us all." The guests raised their glasses, their cheers ringing out. Kira smiled, her lips curved in a perfect arc, but her mind was elsewhere, her heart racing beneath the layers of silk and lace. Logan's voice, smooth and practiced, filled the air with words of love and devotion, but they felt hollow, brittle, ready to shatter under the weight of truth. Big Shaq stood a little straighter, his eyes narrowing. He could feel it, the tension thickening like storm clouds on the horizon. He didn't know exactly what was coming, but he could sense that beneath the polished surface, something dark and dangerous was waiting to be revealed. And as the final notes of the toast faded into the heavy air, the first threads of unraveling began. Logan Mercer, the polished, ever-smiling fiancé, moved among them like a master of ceremonies, shaking hands, offering tight embraces, but his eyes often flickered toward Kira with something far colder than affection. In quiet moments, away from the crowds but never entirely hidden, Logan's impatience seeped through his charm. He'd correct Kira's steps with clipped words when she brushed too close to a table's edge or missed a social cue by a breath. His voice, smooth as silk to outsiders, had an undertone of frustration she alone could hear. "Careful, darling," he murmured under his breath at one point, fingers tightening just a fraction too hard on her elbow. To onlookers, it appeared a gesture of support, but to Kira it was a command. The true depth of Logan's cruelty wasn't in loud accusations or overt mockery. It was in the subtleties, the way he placed her wine glass just out of reach, so she'd fumble for it while he smiled apologetically to guests. The way he guided her to sit in chairs that made her look frail, her posture awkward against the stiff backrests. In front of his friends, Logan's tone shifted into casual dismissiveness. "She's a brave one, managing so well despite everything," he said once, loud enough for Kira to catch but soft enough for others to mistake it for admiration. His friends chuckled, not unkindly but with a trace of amusement that set Kira's skin crawling. Kira felt these moments stack up like stones in her chest. She knew Logan's world thrived on appearances. The perfect host, the loving fiancé, the gracious son, but she also sensed the seething beneath his surface. His mother, Evelyn, wore her approval like a mask, her smile a brittle shield against deeper feelings. Evelyn's lips twitched slightly at Kira's missteps, her eyes darting to Logan's with a flicker of shared understanding. Kira recognized that flicker, the shared glances that spoke volumes of expectation and disdain. Yet, trapped by loyalty, by the weight of promises made and the silent hope of love that could perhaps be genuine, Kira bit back her instincts and played her role. But not everyone was so easily deceived. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal stood on the margins of the garden, leaning casually against a marble column as though absorbed in his phone. His broad frame blended into the architecture, yet his eyes missed nothing. He observed Logan's gestures, The tight smiles of the Mercer family, the stiff discomfort of the staff. His instincts, honed over years of navigating boardrooms and locker rooms alike, told him that something here wasn't right. The way Logan hovered too closely to Kira, the slight tightening of his jaw when she made a misstep, the way his laughter never quite reached his eyes, all of it painted a picture that didn't match the polished narrative Logan was so carefully weaving. A low murmur rippled through the crowd as Logan's cousin, Alistair, made a crude joke about Kira's cane during a lull in the conversation. The laughter was muted but complicit, a bubble of shared cruelty that burst too quickly into silence. Kira's cheeks flushed with shame, but Logan only offered a perfunctory chuckle, before steering her away, whispering with forced amusement, "Ignore them, sweetheart. They don't understand." But his words weren't for her comfort. They were a dismissal, a way to maintain control while appearing magnanimous. In the shadowed hallway near the kitchens, staff members exchanged uneasy glances. One of the caterers, a young woman named Felicity, whispered to a colleague, "This doesn't feel right. The way he treats her. It's like she's a prop, not a person." Her companion nodded, his eyes darting toward the garden where Logan stood, all smiles and charm. "Keep your head down," he murmured. "This family doesn't forgive mistakes." Shaq caught fragments of these whispers, the quiet discontent threading its way through the polished event. He filed them away, his posture remaining relaxed but his attention razor-sharp. He noted the way Kira's shoulders stiffened under Logan's touch, the way her smile faltered at moments when she thought no one was watching. He saw the tight-lipped smiles of Logan's friends, the subtle nods exchanged like secret codes. There was a performance unfolding, one meant to dazzle the guests and the cameras but built on a foundation of cracks. As the afternoon wore on, Logan's behavior became increasingly transparent. His patience wore thin when Kira paused too long during introductions, his hand tightening on her waist with just enough force to remind her who was in control. He made sure she overheard snippets of his conversations with friends, hinting at his frustrations, painting her as fragile and dependent. His tone, always just on the edge of audible, was laced with exasperation. "She means well, but sometimes it's exhausting," he confided to a friend, casting a glance over his shoulder at Kira. The friend nodded sympathetically, unaware or uncaring that Kira stood just out of earshot. Throughout it all, Shaq maintained his position on the fringes, a silent sentinel absorbing every nuance. He could feel the undercurrents, the way Logan's mask of affability was beginning to slip, revealing glimpses of something far more corrosive. The guests continued to drink and chatter, their laughter ringing out beneath the bright sky, but a subtle shift in the air hinted at an impending storm. Logan's mother watched her son with a mixture of pride and calculation, her eyes sharp behind her Felicity, the caterer, slipped quietly into the house, her unease palpable. Kira, though trapped by circumstances and appearances, began to see the threads pulling tight around her. The quiet cruelty, the unspoken racism veiled beneath sympathy, the manipulations disguised as affection, it all sharpened into focus. She felt the weight of the eyes on her, the unspoken judgments wrapped in polite phrases. Yet she held her head high, her movements precise, her voice measured. Inside, though, her heart beat with a rising urgency, her mind tracing the contours of a plan she hadn't yet dared to admit even to herself. As Logan gathered his inner circle for a private toast beneath the awning, his voice low and his words slurred slightly from the wine, Shaq exchanged a subtle nod with Felicity, who had returned carrying a silver tray. The gesture was small, easily missed, but it spoke of understanding. Shaq wasn't just watching, he was preparing. The mask of celebration still glittered around them, but the truth was threading itself tighter with every forced smile, every whispered comment, every stolen glance. And in the growing shadows of the estate, something was beginning to stir, a storm building in silence. The light from the canopies draped the Mercer estate in a glow that might have been called enchanting, but it felt more like a disguise to Kira. The hush of expensive fabrics brushing against manicured grass, the chime of crystal glasses as guests toasted the couple-to-be, and the soft strings of the quartet playing near the fountain. All of it was a performance, a delicate illusion layered over something darker. Kira, still poised and collected, moved carefully through the crowd, her white cane a practiced part of her presence. She caught fragments of conversations in passing, compliments thin as air, pity disguised as praise, but she wore her smile like armor. At a small knot of guests near the edge of the canopies, she heard Logan's voice, low but audible, carried just far enough to reach her ears. He was speaking to Brent Calloway, his closest confidant, and a man whose tailored suits, An easy charm did little to hide his smirking cruelty. Kira paused, angling herself as though distracted by the nearby floral arrangements, her ears straining to catch their words. "Relax, Brent. She's too blind to notice anything," Logan murmured, his tone dipped in disdain. "Today's her big day, right? Might as well make it memorable. Everyone loves a good tearjerker, especially when it makes me look like the hero." Brent's laugh, low and mocking, grated against Kira's composure. "So what's the plan? Leave her standing there while you walk off with Vanessa?" Logan's voice tightened. "Not so obvious. I'll make it seem like I was pressured into this wedding out of guilt, that I tried to make it work. People will sympathize. They'll see me as the good guy who couldn't handle the strain of her condition. And then Vanessa steps in. Perfect timing, perfect story. Kira becomes the tragic figure, and I come out clean." Kira's hand gripped her cane harder, the smooth lacquered wood digging into her palm. For a moment she felt the weight of his betrayal collapse onto her chest, constricting her breath. Her mind replayed every moment. Logan's careful tenderness, his whispered assurances, his public declarations of devotion, all revealed as nothing more than a calculated performance. But instead of faltering, she let her shoulders relax, smoothing her expression into polite detachment. She would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. As Logan and Brent continued their low conversation, their words painting a grotesque caricature of love and loyalty, Kira quietly stepped away, her cane tapping softly against the flagstones. She moved deliberately, her pace steady, slipping through the edges of the crowd. Her pulse beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her outward composure remained flawless. She needed to think, to breathe, to plan, but she was not alone in her realization. In the shadows near the back entrance to the estate, Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal leaned against a stone column, his frame half obscured by the trailing ivy. His phone was dark in his hand, forgotten as he watched the scene unfold. He had noticed the sharpness in Logan's voice, the too familiar smirk of Brent Calloway, the way Kira had tensed ever so slightly. He didn't need to hear every word to understand the undercurrent of cruelty at play. Shaq's mind worked quietly, piecing together the fragments he had overheard with the discomfort he had already sensed. He knew the Mercer's reputation for maintaining appearances at all costs. He knew Logan's ambition and charm were weapons in his social arsenal. What he hadn't anticipated was the calculated malice behind Logan's public persona. His hands curled slightly into fists, not from anger but from the weight of realization. He stepped deeper into the shadows, his presence still unnoticed but his purpose sharpening. Inside the tent, the laughter rose in a crescendo as waiters refilled glasses and guests clustered around the canapes. The air was thick with perfume and the faint, metallic scent of too polished silverware. Kira moved along the perimeter of the gathering, her steps precise, each movement controlled. She didn't dare glance back at Logan and Brent, knowing their attention had already shifted to the next performance. She could almost hear the invisible script Logan had written, see the staged collapse of the ceremony he intended to orchestrate. A few steps away, she paused near a table, where a young server, his expression uneasy, was replenishing a tray of delicate pastries. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the eclairs. Kira lowered her voice, just enough for him to hear, her words smooth and calm. "I know what's happening," she murmured. "If you see anything else, or if you hear something you think I should know, find me, please." The server glanced at her, his hesitation obvious, then gave a brief nod before returning to his work. Kira stepped away, her pulse slowing as she gathered herself. She felt the threads of the situation tangling around her, but she was determined to unravel them. She moved toward the edge of the garden, where the hedges cast long shadows, stepping into the coolness beneath the leaves. From the shadows, Shaq watched her approach, his expression unreadable. She paused, her head tilted slightly, as though listening to the rustle of the leaves, the distant hum of conversation. For a moment, their eyes met, not in overt recognition but in shared understanding. Shaq's subtle nod was all she needed to know he was on her side, though no words passed between them. The sun dipped lower, painting the estate in shades of gold and rose, but the beauty of the scene only heightened the tension. Logan and Brent's laughter rang out briefly, before they slipped inside the estate, their conversation swallowed by the clink of crystal and the swell of music. Kira watched them go, her thoughts a silent storm. In that moment, the day's events rearranged themselves in her mind. The dress that had arrived too late and too wrong, the makeup applied with a heavy hand, the misplaced glances of the guests. It wasn't carelessness, it was deliberate. It was a prelude to the humiliation Logan had scripted for her. Her fingers curled tighter around her cane, but she forced herself to exhale, to let the fury settle into a cold, clear focus. Nearby, Shaq checked his phone, sending a single message to a contact whose name he hadn't needed in years. A quiet warning, a preparation. He knew now that this wasn't just an uncomfortable social gathering. It was a stage set for betrayal, and though Kira hadn't yet revealed her plan, Shaq suspected she had one. He intended to be ready when the curtain fell. As the music swelled and the laughter grew louder, Kira rejoined the crowd, her smile polite but her heart steady with resolve. Logan's trap was set, but he hadn't counted on her resilience, or on the quiet strength standing in the shadows, watching and waiting for the right moment to step into the light. Waiters moved like chess pieces between clusters of laughter and raised glasses, their trays bearing delicate canapés and shimmering cocktails. Beneath the perfect surface, though, there was a tremor, a pulse of something unseen but unmistakable. Kira felt it with every breath, every subtle glance exchanged over her head, every murmur that didn't quite fade as she passed. Her supposed bridal gown arrived as the sun hovered just past its zenith. The garment was ushered into her preparation suite in a flurry of apologies from the stylists, who claimed a last-minute mix-up had delayed delivery. Kira's fingers, when they brushed the fabric, recognized immediately the cheapness of the material, the scratchy overlay where silk should have been, the uneven hems. Her breath caught as the stylists, handpicked by Logan's mother, fussed around her, cooing softly but exchanging furtive glances that betrayed their intentions. The gown's color was a pale, almost garish peach, stark against her rich skin tone. The neckline dipped awkwardly, the bodice pinched too tight, and the train dragged unevenly across the floor. It was not the dress she had chosen weeks ago, with meticulous care, but an impostor designed to make her look comical, a spectacle. Logan's voice floated through the corridor outside, smooth and confident as he charmed a group of influential guests with a rehearsed laugh. Inside the suite, her makeup was applied with hands that trembled just enough to smudge the lines of her lips, the blush applied too heavy, the eyeshadow garish and uneven. Kira sat still, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Her heart pounded beneath her ribs like a caged drum, but her voice when she finally spoke was quiet and calm. "It's lovely," she murmured, nodding just enough to send the stylists bustling away with relieved murmurs of gratitude. Once alone, she stood, smoothing the distorted gown with her hands. In the mirror she saw not a bride but a caricature, a cruel joke waiting to unfold. Yet her eyes, hidden behind the dark glasses she wore out of necessity and choice, flashed with something fierce and unyielding. She took a deep breath, letting the anger coil tight in her chest, then exhaled slowly, steadying her hands as she adjusted the neckline herself. If they wanted her to look absurd, she would give them a show, but one they would never forget. Out in the garden, Logan was circling like a predator dressed as a prince. His voice rose above the hum of conversation, recounting stories of overcoming challenges with Kira, his words dipped in honey but laced with condescension. Guests, already loosened by drinks and sunlight, nodded and murmured approval, their expressions a mix of admiration and envy. Among them, Shaq watched from a distance, his face impassive, his large hands folded in front of him as if in silent prayer. But his eyes never left Kira even when she wasn't in view. He saw her emerge from the house, escorted by one of the stylists who carried her train like it was a burden. The guests turned, a collective intake of breath rushing over the gathering like a wind through dry leaves. The gown's ill fit was obvious, the makeup harsh under the natural light. Whispers rose in waves, glances exchanged behind gloved hands, and Logan, standing at the head of the ceremony space, barely concealed his smirk. Kira felt the weight of 100 eyes pinning her in place. Her cheeks burned, but not with embarrassment, with a cold determination that chilled her bones. She walked forward, each step measured and deliberate, the tap of her cane rhythmic against the stone path. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, soft but firm, reminding her of the dignity no one could steal. Her pulse steadied with the memory, her grip tightening on the cane as though it were a sword. Logan's smirk twitched, his eyes narrowing as he watched her approach. His friends, Brent among them, exchanged low chuckles, nodding toward Kira's appearance, as though in on a private joke. The discomfort among the guests was palpable, yet no one spoke up. Not yet. Logan's mother, Evelyn, stood at the edge of the seating area, her lips pressed into a thin line, her pearl necklace glinting in the sunlight as she whispered something to a man beside her. Shaq moved slightly closer, his presence still quiet but undeniable. His gaze locked onto Kira's, a subtle nod of solidarity passing between them like an unspoken vow. He could see her struggle, the crackling tension in her jaw, the steel threading through her spine. He saw her gather herself, lifting her chin just slightly as she approached the front of the ceremony space. The officiant cleared his throat, his voice wavering as he glanced toward Logan, who raised a hand casually, signaling him to wait. Logan turned to face the gathered guests, his voice rising in practiced projection. "Before we begin," he said, his tone rich with false sincerity, "I just want to take a moment to speak from the heart." A hush fell over the crowd. Cameras shifted, capturing the tableau, Logan's poised figure in his tailored suit, Kira's awkward stance in her distorted gown, and Shaq's looming presence at the edge of the scene. Logan's voice softened, feigning vulnerability. "This journey has been challenging. Kira has shown such bravery, such strength in the face of adversity. But sometimes, love is not enough." He paused, letting the words sink in, savoring the subtle gasps of surprise from the audience. "It's not fair to her, or to me, to continue this charade. I've tried, truly I have, but it's time to be honest with myself, with her, with all of you." The tension snapped taut as a bowstring. Kira stood frozen, her heart hammering so loud it drowned out the murmurs. Logan's smile was faint but triumphant, his eyes glinting with the thrill of control. But then, at the very edge of the crowd, a faint movement caught Kira's eye. Shaq, silent and towering, shifted his stance, his expression unreadable, but his intent clear. He was no longer merely observing. His presence now was a silent rebuke, a reminder that even in the face of betrayal, strength could find an ally. Kira inhaled slowly, her lips pressing together. She wasn't broken. Not yet. Not ever. As Logan turned back to face her, his smirk widening, she tilted her head just slightly, her glasses catching the light. In that instant, the cracks in the carefully staged perfection widened into fissures, and beneath the laughter, a storm brewed, silent but unstoppable. The ceremony space shimmered with an orchestrated beauty, but beneath the perfection, an almost electric tension crackled in the air. Kira's hands trembled as she adjusted her grip on the cane, each step guided by the soft murmurs of the staff assigned to her side. Her heart pounded so fiercely it echoed in her ears, drowning out the hum of conversation and the distant strains of the string quartet. She was walking not to a celebration, but toward a carefully staged downfall, and she felt every eye upon her as the garden hushed in reverence, or perhaps curiosity. The staff positioned her before Logan, his tall figure framed by an arch of roses and trailing ivy. He turned to her with a smile that gleamed too bright, the practiced flicker of a man used to playing roles for an audience. Cameras clicked softly, capturing the moment. The blind bride, graceful but fragile, her fiancé steady and compassionate, ready to speak words of devotion. Kira felt the weight of the gaze, the collective expectation pressing down on her, but she stood steady, her face calm, her pulse raging beneath her skin. Logan cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the crowd. His voice, smooth and sonorous, carried easily over the garden. "Family, friends," he began, pausing to glance around, letting the murmurs settle into silence. "Today we gather to witness not just a union of two people, but a testament to resilience and love." His tone thickened with feigned emotion, his gaze dropping as though overcome by the weight of his own words. "But there are moments in life when love must face reality, when we must admit that no matter how strong our feelings, the road ahead is too difficult." A ripple ran through the crowd, a shift of unease, the beginning of whispered speculation. Logan continued, his voice catching just enough to appear vulnerable. "I stand before you, a man who has tried, truly tried, to be worthy of the love Kira has shown, but I cannot, in good conscience, continue this journey. It would be selfish of me to trap her in a life she doesn't deserve, a life where she must depend on me, where she cannot be free." Kira's breath caught in her throat, her fingers tightening on the cane until her knuckles blanched. She felt her body sway slightly, but she straightened her spine, forcing the tremble from her voice, though she said nothing. Logan's words weren't a confession, they were a performance, each sentence crafted for maximum sympathy, each pause perfectly timed to let the weight of his supposed heartbreak settle into the minds of the guests. The silence shattered, as a figure emerged from the edge of the crowd, a vision in sleek navy silk and diamonds. Vanessa Drake, her face a mask of demure sadness and quiet strength, stepped forward as if summoned by Logan's unspoken need. The guests gasped, the whispers rising to a low hum of astonishment. Vanessa's hands, slender and adorned with glittering rings, reached for Logan's arm, her expression a careful blend of apology and love. She played her part flawlessly, casting herself as the woman who understood him, the savior who would step in where Kira could not. Kira stood frozen, her mind a storm of fury and betrayal. The calculated cruelty of Logan's scheme unfurled before her like a well-rehearsed play. He wasn't just ending their engagement. He was casting her as the burden he could nobly cast aside, framing himself as a man torn between duty and love, claiming victimhood while crushing her beneath the weight of public humiliation. Cameras clicked faster, capturing the tableau, Logan's broad shoulders hunched in apparent sorrow, Vanessa's hand gentle on his sleeve, Kira standing silent and seemingly defeated. The narrative was writing itself, each flash cementing the story that Logan had so carefully crafted. But then, from the periphery of the gathering, a shift in the atmosphere drew attention. A murmur spread like ripples on a pond, heads turning, eyes widening. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal, who had been a silent sentinel through the ceremony, stepped forward. His towering frame cast a long shadow across the scene, his expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakable. The air seemed to thicken around him, the low hum of conversation faltering into stunned silence. Shaq's movements were unhurried, but deliberate, each step drawing the crowd's gaze away from Logan's contrived heartbreak to something far more compelling. His suit was impeccably tailored, but it was his calm, steady gaze that held the audience captive. He said nothing, but the shift in energy was palpable, a silent declaration that the performance unfolding at the altar was not the only story to be told. Logan's face twitched, a brief flash of irritation crossing his features, before he masked it with another layer of false sorrow. "Mr. O'Neal," he said smoothly, his voice raised just enough to carry, "I wasn't aware you were attending today. It's an honor, of course, but I hope you'll understand the difficulty of this moment." Shaq remained silent, his gaze steady, his hands folded in front of him. The weight of his presence pressed against the fragile fabric of Logan's deception, creating fractures that no amount of charm could mend. Kira felt the air shift, her pulse slowing, her breath evening out. For the first time, the weight pressing down on her seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet strength that had nothing to do with sight and everything to do with resolve. The guests, sensing the shift, turned their attention fully to Shaq, the murmurs fading into anticipation. Logan's confidence faltered, his words drying up as he struggled to maintain control of the narrative. Vanessa's grip on his arm tightened slightly, her smile wavering. The cameras, once focused solely on the tableau of betrayal, now angled toward Shaq, capturing his silent defiance. Kira straightened her shoulders, her voice still absent, but her presence speaking volumes. She let the silence stretch, a counterpoint to Logan's hollow declarations, her calm a rebuke to his performance. In that stillness, the carefully staged ruin began to crumble, the truth flickering at the edges of the spectacle. Shaq's voice, when it finally came, was low but resonant, slicing through the garden's tense quiet. "I think we've heard enough," he said, his tone measured and even. The words were simple, but their weight was undeniable. The audience shifted, a collective intake of breath, as if bracing for the next act in a play they hadn't known they were attending. Logan's mask slipped for just a heartbeat, his mouth opening in a protest that never fully formed. Kira felt a surge of quiet vindication, her heart steady now, her grip on her cane loosening. She wasn't broken, and she wasn't alone. Shaq's presence, his unspoken support, had punctured the illusion Logan had so carefully built, exposing the hollow core of his manipulation. As the sun dipped lower, casting the estate in long shadows and gilded light, the moment of ruin reached its peak, not for Kira, but for Logan. The scene, crafted to make him a tragic hero, now stood as a testament to his deceit, his cruelty laid bare under the watchful eyes of an audience that was finally beginning to see the truth. The shifting light turned the edges of the scene molten gold, but all its warmth seemed drained from the gathering. As the tension thickened, Kira stood motionless, her slender form framed by the arch of roses, where Logan had positioned her like a living ornament in his twisted theater. But something had changed. The fragile illusion of her helplessness, so carefully curated by Logan's design, was beginning to fracture under the weight of her silence and Shaq's silent defiance. For a breathless moment, no one moved. Logan's hand hovered in the air, as if gesturing toward Vanessa, whose diamond-studded fingers still lightly grazed his sleeve. But the confidence he had worn all day, like a tailored suit, faltered as Shaq's eyes locked onto him. Without a word, Kira reached up, her fingers brushing the edge of the dark glasses perched on her nose. The world around her seemed to narrow, sound fading into a hollow echo, as she drew in a slow, measured breath. Then, with deliberate care, she slid the glasses down, revealing her eyes to the stunned crowd. They were not vacant or sightless as many had assumed. Instead, they were clear, sharp, and unflinching, catching the late afternoon light like twin blades. The shock rippled outward in a wave. Gasps cut through the silence. Camera shutters clicked faster, and whispers rose into a low, confused hum. Kira's expression, calm yet resolute, cut through the gathering's daze like a scalpel. The truth she had hidden now standing stark and undeniable before them all. "I'm not blind," she said, her voice carrying across the garden, steady and precise. "Not anymore, and I haven't been for months." The crowd recoiled as though struck. Evelyn Mercer's hand fluttered to her throat, her mouth opening in silent disbelief. Vanessa's eyes widened, her grip on Logan's arm faltering as she instinctively stepped back. Logan's face drained of color, his practiced smile cracking into something brittle and transparent. His lips parted to protest, but Kira's hand moved with elegant precision, drawing a small, sleek device from the hidden folds of her gown. "This," she continued, holding the device high enough for all to see, "is a recording. Conversations, plans, whispers, all the words you thought I couldn't hear. I did. I heard everything." The playback began, Logan's own voice spilling into the air, crystal clear and damning. "She's just a prop, Brent. A means to an end. People eat up the blind bride narrative. I'll make her look like the fragile heroine, and then I'll step away clean. Sympathy and a free pass for me." The crowd erupted into a cacophony of gasps and protests, some turning away, others leaning in with morbid fascination. Logan's mask shattered, his mouth opening and closing like a man drowning in his own lies. Vanessa's calculated poise collapsed, her cheeks flushed red as she backed away, attempting to slip into the throng of guests. Kira's voice cut through the noise like a whip. "There are photos, messages, witnesses. You think you could orchestrate my humiliation, parade me as a broken woman for your gain, and leave me here to pick up the pieces. But I'm not the one crumbling today, Logan. You are." Shaq moved then, not with dramatic flair, but with the measured gravity of a man who understood the importance of presence. His broad frame eclipsed the quivering figure of Logan, his voice deep and resonant as he spoke for the first time, addressing the crowd but aimed squarely at Logan's shrinking confidence. "You planned this, Mercer. You thought no one would see, but the world is watching now, and they're seeing the truth." Logan stammered, his words garbled and weak. She lied. She's been hiding the truth. She played us all." Kira's laugh was soft but cutting. "I played no one. I protected myself. I watched you reveal exactly who you are when you thought I couldn't see. I listened when you thought I was deaf to your cruelty. I waited, not because I was weak, but because I needed to be certain. And now, everyone knows what you've done." The crowd, momentarily silenced by the recording, now surged with indignation and disbelief. Murmurs grew louder, guests exchanging glances that shifted from sympathy for Logan to thinly veiled disgust. Elderly family friends shook their heads, while younger attendees whispered furiously into their phones. Even the staff, usually invisible shadows at such events, exchanged glances of quiet vindication. Vanessa made a final desperate attempt to flee, but Shaq's quiet, steady presence at the edge of the crowd blocked her path. His gaze pinned her in place without so much as a word, his stature a silent barrier that reinforced Kira's stand. She froze, her shoulders hunching as though trying to disappear into the folds of her gown. Evelyn, her mask of decorum slipping, called out, "Logan, say something, fix this." But there was no fixing it. Logan's shoulders sagged, his mouth still trying to form words, but Kira's evidence and his own voice filled the air between them like an impenetrable wall. His fall from grace was swift and complete, the power he wielded through manipulation now crumbling into dust beneath the weight of truth. Shaq stepped closer to Kira then, not to take the spotlight, but to stand beside her as a testament to solidarity. His voice, though quiet, carried authority that silenced the garden. "This isn't just about what was done to Kira. It's about how easily people turn a blind eye when someone like Logan spins a story. But the truth has a way of rising. And today, Kira didn't just find her voice. She found her power." Kira turned to meet his gaze, her own steady and calm, and for the first time that day, A real, unforced smile curved her lips. "Thank you," she said softly, not just to Shaq but to the guests, to the silent staff who had watched and whispered, to the universe that had finally turned in her favor. The moment crescendoed, not with violent confrontation, but with the quiet, undeniable triumph of truth over deception. Logan's world, meticulously built on lies and control, disintegrated before the collective gaze of an audience no longer willing to applaud. As the last echoes of his confession faded into the garden's stillness, Kira stood taller, her presence commanding, her spirit unbroken. She wasn't the blind bride today. She was the woman who had seen everything, and chosen to make sure the world saw it too. For a fleeting second after Kira's revelation, the garden held its collective breath. It was a moment suspended between denial and reality, as if the assembled guests were searching for a thread of Logan's story they could still believe. But the recordings, the clarity of Kira's voice, and the damning proof laid bare in front of everyone had shifted the ground beneath their feet. The champagne flutes trembled in hands, laughter choked off mid-sentence, and whispered reassurances turned into stammered apologies, as guests began to understand the depth of the deception they'd been complicit in celebrating. Logan, ever the master of narrative control, lunged for what shreds of the story he could still spin. His voice, strained and louder than before, rang out over the crowd. "You have to believe me," he pleaded, forcing a ragged tremor into his tone. "She was lying to me, to all of us. She hid her recovery. She staged this to make me look like the villain." His eyes darted wildly, searching for sympathy among his friends and family, but the web of his lies had snapped, leaving him isolated in a crowd of faces growing colder by the second. He gestured toward Shaq, the desperation sharpening the edges of his words. "And him. Shaquille O'Neal. What's he even doing here? He's interfering in something he doesn't understand. This isn't his story, it's mine." Logan's voice cracked, the polish falling away to reveal the shrill undercurrent of panic. Shaq's response was not a flurry of retorts or grandstanding gestures. Instead, he stood steady and composed, his voice even but commanding enough to cut through Logan's frantic protests. "This was never your story, Mercer," he said, his gaze unwavering, his tone carrying the quiet strength of a man who didn't need theatrics to be heard. "You twisted it to suit your ambitions, your need for sympathy, for applause. Kira's story is hers, and she's telling it now, clearly enough that even you can't silence it." The crowd rippled with a mixture of surprise and quiet approval. The shift in the atmosphere, as palpable as the breeze stirring the silk of the tents. Faces that had turned toward Logan, with confusion now looked to Kira, with something closer to respect. The murmurs of outrage grew louder, sharp with words like disgrace and betrayal, while influencers and media figures clutched their phones and cameras, capturing every second of Logan's unraveling, for the world beyond the estate's manicured walls. Sponsors, previously eager to align themselves with the Mercer name, began to distance themselves with silent steps. A sharp-suited representative from a major fashion house slipped quietly from the crowd, her phone already in hand, texting furiously. Another, a well-known entertainment producer, muttered under his breath to his assistant, "Pull our support, this whole thing's toxic now." The tide was turning, not in whispers but in decisive, irreversible shifts. Logan's mother, Evelyn, stood rigid near the front row, her face pale beneath the careful layers of makeup. She reached out to her son, but her hand hovered hesitantly in the air, as though she'd suddenly realized that any association with him was now a liability. Logan, seeing even her falter, lashed out verbally. "You all were in on this. You pushed me into this engagement. You wanted the headlines, the attention." His voice rose, cracking with fury as he scanned the increasingly hostile crowd. Kira, who had remained silent through Logan's desperate attempts to salvage control, finally spoke. Her voice was low but carried clearly across the stunned silence. "No one pushed you into anything. Logan, you made your choices. You exploited my trust, my vulnerability, for your image. And when you realized you couldn't control me, you decided to destroy me instead. But I'm still standing, and you—" Shaq stepped forward slightly, his presence quiet yet commanding. He lifted his hands, palms open, not as a threat but as a gesture of de-escalation. "Let's not forget the bigger truth here," he said, his voice calm but firm, addressing not just Logan but the entire gathering. "This isn't about who can shout the loudest, or who has the most cameras pointed at them. It's about dignity, respect, and justice." Kira showed grace in the face of betrayal. "That's what we should be focusing on, not the spectacle Logan tried to create." but the strength she showed in choosing to rise above it. The shift was almost tangible. Guests, drawn in by the drama, now found themselves captivated by the quiet resilience radiating from Kira. Her calm, her unflinching resolve, stood in stark contrast to Logan's unraveling fury. Even the staff, who had watched from the sidelines with careful neutrality, now exchanged nods of quiet approval, their loyalty tilting perceptibly toward Kira. Vanessa, still standing awkwardly at the periphery, made a final attempt to salvage her own image, stepping forward with a forced, brittle smile. "I didn't know about any of this," she began, her voice faltering as it tried to strike a note of innocence. "I thought Logan was genuine. I thought Kira was comfortable with the arrangement." Shaq's gaze pinned her in place, the weight of his silent judgment forcing her words to falter. "You knew," he said softly, his voice just loud enough to carry. "You played your part because it suited you. But now the truth is out, and no amount of pretending can erase what's been seen." Vanessa's shoulders sagged, her smile crumbling into a grimace, as she turned, slipping through the crowd, like a shadow evaporating at dawn. The cameras followed her briefly, but the real focus remained on Kira, standing tall and composed, her eyes clear and her voice steady. Logan's protests dwindled into muttered denials, his shoulders drooping as the reality of his exposure sank in. The guests, now fully aligned with Kira, began to murmur openly, voices tinged with indignation and sympathy. Some approached her tentatively, offering quiet words of support, while others simply watched, their gazes filled with a newfound respect. Kira accepted the gestures with quiet dignity, nodding graciously but not seeking the spotlight. She understood now that this moment wasn't about vindication through public applause. It was about reclaiming her agency, her identity, and her truth. The woman who had been positioned as a victim of circumstance had transformed in front of their eyes into a figure of strength and integrity. Shaq stood at her side, his presence steady but unobtrusive, his respect for her autonomy clear in the way he allowed her to lead the moment. His voice, when he finally spoke again, was low and calm. "Let's leave this spectacle behind," he said, addressing both Kira and the guests. "The real story isn't what happened here today, it's what Kira chose to do in the face of betrayal. Let's not forget that." And with those words, the spell of the performance shattered. The cameras lowered, the whispers faded into silence, and the guests found themselves caught in the quiet gravity of truth. Kira, no longer the silent, fragile figure Logan had tried to craft, stood at the center of it all, her quiet strength a beacon against the crumbling facades around her. The tide had turned, and the world would not forget it. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the estate's manicured grounds, the world beyond those gates had already begun to stir with the tremors of what had unfolded. In an era where truth could travel faster than light, Kira's story didn't simply emerge from the confines of a scandalous wedding. It exploded across social media feeds, news outlets, and countless screens around the world. Her name, once whispered in elite circles as the fragile bride-to-be, now blazed across headlines as the woman who unmasked deception with a quiet, searing power that left the crowd, and Logan Mercer himself, speechless. Within hours, images of the confrontation flooded news sites. Screens were filled with the contrast of Kira's poised figure against Logan's unraveling composure, the stark evidence of his manipulation exposed under the relentless glare of truth. Clips of her removing her dark glasses, revealing her clear, unflinching gaze, went viral, shared with captions hailing her as a symbol of resilience and justice. The audio recording of Logan's calculated betrayal, once meant to remain hidden, became the rallying cry for conversations about gaslighting, privilege, and the insidious ways power can be abused under the guise of affection. As reporters scrambled to get statements and influencers dissected every frame of the confrontation, Logan's world collapsed in slow but steady implosion. His family's attempts at damage control were clumsy and ineffective, drowned beneath the sheer weight of evidence and the public's fury. Sponsorships disappeared overnight, business partnerships dissolved, and carefully curated political ties evaporated, as public opinion turned irrevocably against him. Where once he had stood as a symbol of charm and upward mobility, he now became the cautionary tale of how arrogance and deception can lead to a downfall as swift as it is complete. Yet while Logan's name darkened, Kira's rose, not as a figure of pity or victimhood, but as a beacon of strength and truth-telling. Morning shows clamored for interviews, online platforms requested op-eds, and speaking engagements flooded her inbox. But through it all, Kira remained cautious, her steps measured. She understood the fickle nature of public attention, and she was determined not to let her story be repackaged into a simplistic narrative of triumph. It was more than a viral moment. It was a reclamation of her voice, her dignity, and her agency. Shaq stood by her side, not as the center of the story, but as a steadfast presence in the background, ensuring she was never forced to navigate the sudden spotlight alone. His quiet support was a counterbalance to the chaotic rush of media demands, his calm offering her a grounding presence. When she appeared for her first carefully chosen interview, she insisted on speaking not from a scripted statement, but from her heart. "I didn't want to become a symbol," she said softly, her voice clear despite the floodlights and microphones. "I just wanted to be seen for who I really am. And I wanted others who've been silenced to know they aren't alone. This wasn't just my story. It's a reminder of what happens when we let others define our worth, when we believe their lies over our own truth." Shaq watched from the sidelines, his arms folded loosely, his expression one of quiet pride. He fielded reporters' questions with firm, courteous deflection, redirecting attention back to Kira and the message she wanted to share. His name, once splashed in headlines alongside hers, gradually faded from the central narrative, not because he was absent, but because he chose to step back, giving Kira the space to shine without distraction. Behind the scenes, however, his influence was undeniable. He connected her with trusted advisors, helped her vet offers from organizations wanting to amplify her voice, and ensured she had the resources to make her next steps not reactive, but intentional. Together, they crafted a plan that allowed Kira to transform the viral storm into a platform for advocacy, for change, for a narrative that wasn't about revenge or spectacle but about integrity and hope. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, interviews, and quiet moments, where Kira caught her breath and remembered who she was before the chaos. Her mother, who had flown in the morning after the confrontation, held her close in moments of exhaustion, reminding her of the quiet strength she had inherited. Her brother, newly arrived from out of state, stood by her like a sentinel, his military precision now dedicated to shielding her from the onslaught of attention. In the quiet of Shaq's private office, a space far removed from the glare of cameras, Kira and Shaq sat together as dusk bled into night. The hum of the city beyond the windows was a distant murmur, replaced by the softer sounds of conversation and the occasional clink of teacups. "I didn't think it would all come out like this," she admitted, her voice tinged with both relief and the weight of what she had endured. Shaq leaned back, his expression thoughtful but gentle. "Sometimes the truth has its own timing," he said quietly. "You were ready. That's what made the difference. And you didn't need me or anyone else to speak for you. You did that on your own." Her lips curved into a small, genuine smile. "It helped to know someone was in my corner. Not to fix it, but just to be there." He nodded, his own smile understated but warm. "That's what real support looks like. Standing with you, not in front of you." As the evening deepened, Kira found herself finally exhaling, the tension that had coiled tight within her chest loosening. She no longer had to brace herself for Logan's manipulations, for the subtle humiliations disguised as care, for the weight of eyes that saw her as less than. Now she stood not as a victim of betrayal, but as a woman who had chosen to pull back the curtain and let the world see her as she truly was. The next morning, her story was everywhere, but Kira approached it with clarity. She accepted a handful of carefully selected speaking engagements, focusing on organizations dedicated to empowering women, to challenging systems of abuse, to redefining what it meant to stand in one's truth. She refused offers that sought to sensationalize her story, steering clear of media that wanted to turn her into a symbol of pity. Instead, she reclaimed the narrative, shaping it into one of resilience, dignity, and solidarity. Shaq remained a quiet force in the background, his name appearing occasionally in articles, often in passing reference to his support, but never overshadowing Kira's voice. The story wasn't his, and he made sure it never seemed as though he was claiming it. His role was simple: to be the friend, the ally, the quiet strength at her side, ensuring that in the storm's wake, Kira wasn't just seen, she was truly heard. Together they navigated the aftermath with authenticity, their steps guided not by the fleeting glare of viral fame, but by a commitment to something deeper: truth, respect, and the knowledge that even in the face of public betrayal, it was possible to reclaim one's story and emerge not just unbroken, but stronger. The world, so loud with its cameras and headlines, seemed far away in the quiet hush of the lakeside. Here, on the weathered dock stretching over calm, glassy water, Kira sat with her hands folded on her lap, her gaze tracing the rippling reflections of clouds. The late afternoon sun bathed the scene in gold and rose, its warmth a gentle contrast to the cool breeze that teased the hem of her dress. Beside her, Shaq sat in an old wooden chair, his large frame at ease, his presence unintrusive. They had slipped away from the noise not because they were avoiding it, but because this moment away from applause and judgment felt more real than anything that had come before. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Kira let the silence wrap around her like a balm, soothing the raw places left by betrayal, the jagged edges carved by Logan's schemes, and the frenzy of the public's response. The world now knew her as the woman who had seen everything and stood tall in the face of it. But here, under the open sky, she could simply be herself, a woman who had endured, who had survived, and who was still learning what it meant to live beyond survival. Shaq, ever observant, seemed to understand her need for stillness. His hands rested loosely on his knees, his eyes focused on the play of light on the lake. He didn't fill the space with words, didn't try to soothe her with platitudes or promises. His quiet respect allowed her the room to breathe, to gather her thoughts without interruption. Eventually, it was Kira who broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "You know, I used to think that strength meant keeping everything inside, that if I stayed quiet, if I didn't make waves, things would eventually work out. But it didn't, did." Her lips curved into a wry smile, her tone edged with self-awareness. "All that silence did was make it easier for people like Logan to take more. And I let them, because I thought I had to." Shaq's gaze turned toward her then, his expression thoughtful. "You learned though," he said, his voice low, the rumble of it almost blending with the whisper of the water. "You learned when it mattered most. And you didn't just learn, you acted. That's what makes you different, Kira. That's what people are going to remember." She glanced at him, her smile softening into something warmer, more genuine. "People are going to forget eventually," she said quietly. "They'll move on to the next scandal, the next story. But I don't want to be remembered just for what happened to me. I want to be remembered for what I did after." Shaq nodded, his approval quiet but unwavering. "And you will be, not because of the cameras, not because of the attention, but because of who you are. You chose to speak up, you chose to stand, and you chose to keep standing, even when it would have been easier to sit down." For a while they watched the water together, the rhythmic lapping of waves against the dock a grounding sound. Kira drew a slow breath, the tension in her shoulders easing as she allowed herself to feel the truth of his words. It wasn't the public spectacle that defined her, nor the headlines that painted her as either victim or victor. It was her quiet resolve, the choices she'd made when no one was watching, that truly mattered. "I don't want this to just be about me," she said after a moment, her voice gaining a quiet strength. "There are so many others out there, people who've been silenced, controlled, made to feel like they're less than. I want them to know it's not their fault, that it's okay to speak up, to say no, to walk away from people who claim to love them but use that love as a weapon." Shaq's eyes held hers, his respect clear and unspoken. "Then tell them," he said simply. "You have the platform now. Use it for what matters. Not for spectacle, but for change." Her smile, this time, was slow, but steady. "I will," she said, her voice carrying a conviction that hadn't been there before. "But I'll do it my way. No staged interviews, no sound bites, just truth." Shaq's lips curved into a quiet smile of his own. "That's all anyone really wants, Kira. To hear the truth. To see someone who's not afraid to live it." As the sun dipped lower, painting the lake with streaks of amber and crimson, Kira felt a weight lift from her chest. A burden she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying. She no longer felt the need to justify herself, to prove her strength through stoicism or silence. She was done hiding, done pretending. The woman who sat here, beside a friend who had seen her at her most vulnerable and still believed in her, was not the same woman who had stood at the altar trembling under Logan's manipulations. This was a woman who knew her own worth, who had faced the storm and come through with her integrity intact. They stayed there as dusk deepened into twilight, their conversation meandering through memories, reflections, and plans for the future. They spoke of quiet things, the importance of choosing the right people to trust, the quiet power of dignity, the long road of healing. They laughed softly at memories not tainted by betrayal, at small moments of shared humanity. Shaq shared stories from his own past, moments when he'd faced decisions that tested his values, and Kira listened, grateful for the reminder that everyone, no matter how strong, has their own battles. When the stars finally blinked into view, Kira stood, stretching slowly as if shaking off the last remnants of the day's weight. She turned to Shaq, her smile clear and genuine. "Thank you," she said softly, not just for his presence today, but for the quiet, steady support he had offered when she needed it most. "For seeing me, for letting me see myself." Shaq rose as well, towering but gentle. "You never needed me to see you," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You just needed to stop letting others blind you." They left the lakeside together, not as a couple stepping into the public eye, but as two allies bound by respect, purpose, and a shared understanding of what it meant to stand in truth. Kira's steps were lighter, her gaze clear. The world would keep spinning, and stories would rise and fall in the tide of public opinion. But she had found something stronger than headlines and louder than applause. She had found herself. And as the stars scattered across the velvet sky, the message lingered. True power didn't come from wealth or fame. It came from clarity, from seeing and being seen, for exactly who you are. The truth doesn't just belong to one moment. It lives in the choices we make every day. If this story stirred something in you, keep your eyes open and your voice ready. Stand with those who dare to speak out, who reclaim their power, and who show the world what resilience looks like. The next chapter? It's already being written, and it's yours to join.